Hello, welcome to the Roundtable. We'll bring you profound and comprehensive analysis of global affairs happening around the world. Here are today's guests. We are joined by Professor Kim Hannah. Welcome, Professor Kim.
Thanks for having me again.
We are also joined by Professor Lee In-bo. Welcome to the Roundtable.
It's a pleasure to be here.
This year's United Nations General Assembly was held for a week from September 24th. At the General Assembly this year, world leaders gathered to discuss a variety of pending global issues, including the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Another important topic was the civil war in Sudan, which has been continuing over a year. So please give us a summary of the crisis in Sudan.
Right, the conflict began in April 15th, 2023, so it's been a little more than a year.
Right.
And it broke out as first as a fight between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Force, which used to be a paramilitary organization of the Sudanese Armed Forces. Both of the warring factions initially jointly staged a coup d'etat against the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, who's been in power for about 30 years. But once the dictator was ousted, with the power vacuum, they started to fight against each other. The immediate trigger for the conflict itself started out with the efforts to try to bring in the paramilitary Rapid Support Force into the Sudanese Armed Forces, which generated these power struggles, resulting in these conflict between the two warring factions. So overall, the consequences has been devastating. So over 10.7 million people have been displaced, including 6.6 million internally and about 1.8 million who fled to neighboring countries. About 25.6 million people are facing acute hunger, including 755,000 on the brink of famine. Nearly 14 million children requiring humanitarian assistance. International Monetary Fund projected Sudan's real GDP to shrink about 18.3% in 2024. The conflict itself has been overall devastating for human cost as well as the economy. And building upon this, there's been also increase in terms of health crisis as well, with outbreaks of cholera, dengue fever, measles, malaria rapidly spreading out.
So, Professor Kim, usually the biggest victims in military conflicts like the situation in Sudan would be women and children, the weakest, the innocent civilians. And there is a report that if the situation continues till the end of this year, that there will be about 2 million victims dying of hunger, not just by the violence of military conflicts. How serious is the humanitarian crisis in Sudan?
Well, it is quite serious, and as both of you mentioned, the people that are most affected are usually the most vulnerable groups. And so, according to the UN right now, more than a third of Sudan's population, which is around 46 million, are facing severe hunger. And some articles have even suggested that they're eating birds and other animals, and sometimes leaves and dirt because they're hungry. But it's not just food that they're being deprived of; they're being deprived of medical care. They're also being deprived of shelter, and so, in particular, children and women are being affected. And according to Save the Children, half of the children in Sudan live 5 kilometers of the front line, so they're mostly exposed to airstrikes, shelling, and gunfire. And also women, and particularly pregnant and breastfeeding women, are also at risk for both the mother and the child. And so the problem is getting even more serious than it already was, and part of it is because this is just not getting a lot of attention.
Well, Professor Kim just mentioned that the crisis in Sudan has not been really receiving any attention from the media or the other countries. How come the situation has not gathered so much attention from the rest of the world compared to the crisis in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine?
Right. You're correct in the sense that the overall coverage of the media has been very limited compared to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine or Gaza when we think about the crisis in Sudan. According to a report by a German Institute for International and Security Affairs, New York Times published 10 times more articles on Ukraine compared to the ones on Sudan, and 15 times more on those about Gaza. And this is partially related to limited media access, of course. So the Sudanese government as well as the rival forces have been restricting access for the international media. At the same time, it is also reflecting limited interest by the international community as well. if we think about geopolitical importance of the region itself, for Ukraine, for example, it is geographically much more proximate to Europe, and there's a lot more diaspora connections for both Ukraine and Israel or Gaza or a broader Middle East and other regions compared to the Sudanese diaspora. So these things also reflect in terms of the interests by the international community. And of course, overall, geographic proximity is also something that we cannot ignore. At the same time, I think partially it's also because of the limits to the capacity of some of the international powers. Because we have the other two ongoing crises, some argue that diplomatic efforts or political efforts are just stretched so thin, such that the countries such as the United States or other Western powers do not have as much capacity to also engage in the Sudanese conflict.
I see. The Economist magazine said that the war in Sudan is a humanitarian crisis and also a geopolitical time bomb that could send ripple effects to the region and develop into a larger conflict. So, Professor Kim, give us more details about this geopolitical risk or the conditions surrounding the crisis in Sudan.
Yeah, so Sudan is one of the largest countries in Africa, and it is in a very geopolitically important location, but it's also quite an unstable region. And so Sudan shares borders with 7 countries, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, Chad, and each of them have their own security concerns, and they can influence each other. So, like, they can influence their neighboring countries. And so, in this sense, Sudan's military leaders are seeking foreign partners in their struggle for power, but at the same time, other external governments are also trying to influence the situation in Sudan. And because of that, this can escalate not just into a larger geopolitical conflict within the region, but worldwide as well.
So, Professor Lee, if the situation in Sudan is so complicated and situation, external interventions may be a good option for making the situation a little bit better, but it may even further complicate the situation on the ground. Who are the stakeholders outside Sudan?
Right. There are these efforts by the international community to try to resolve the situation one way or another, but as you mentioned, things are much more complicated in the case of Sudan because, as Professor Kim also mentioned earlier, there are other external forces that are involved in the different dynamics of the situation in Sudan. So, for example, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, has been providing support for the Rapid Support Forces, which is one of the warring factions in the country, supplying arms and providing different types of financial support as well. But on the other hand, countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Qatar has been supporting Sudanese armed forces, and complicating this even further, countries like Russia and its now pretty famous Wagner Group, now in the region called the Africa Corps, has been operating in the region. China has been also very interested in the gold and minerals in the country as well, so being involved as well. So all these very complicated web of interests by important regional as well as international actors in the different warring factions of Sudan is again making things much more complicated for concerted efforts by the international community to tackle the situation.
Cameron Hudson, a former U.S. Special Envoy on Sudan, once said, "To get a sense of what state collapse looks like in Sudan, look at Libya and multiply that by 10. So, Professor Kim, what is the, I don't want to say this, worst case scenario when it comes to the situation in Sudan?
Well, as you mentioned, it can mirror Libya in certain ways, and if anything, it can get worse because Sudan is a very large country. It has a very large population, and a lot of people have already died, and international norms and laws are already being violated in that sense. But if the country collapses, it's the government could destabilize, meaning that terrorist groups may find refuge there, meaning that refugees are going to flee even more. So this will not affect just one continent, it'll affect all of them, and it'll have serious impacts all over the world. And so if Sudan does potentially collapse in the future, then this would look a lot like Libya as it does now. And I think part of the reason is that, the global media, as we were talking about earlier, has been relatively silent regarding this because there's a lot more emphasis right now on Ukraine and Gaza. But in many ways, what's happening in Sudan can predict what could happen if an extremely severe global conflict does break out in the future.
So, Professor, what should be done in terms of international cooperation to prevent such a catastrophic situation from even getting worse?
Right. So there are plans. Of course, there are plans, but I think the efforts to support such plans are, at the moment, pretty limited. There was a 2024 Sudan humanitarian response plan coordinated by the United Nations, in particular by the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which is seeking to provide about $2.7 billion to provide assistance to 14.7 million people in need. South Korean government has also been one of the countries to pledge support to provide about 12 million US dollars in humanitarian assistance. However, as of mid-September 2024, the plan was only about 48% funded, so less than half. So although there is this dire need and there has been plans to support this, there has been limited actions, at least up to the current date. And as mentioned earlier, I think one of the most important things that we need is to really try to bring attention to the current situation about the humanitarian crisis, about the hunger, about the potential famine, and calling for international attention by the media can be one of those. The other would be to really try to think about diplomatic solutions to put pressure not only to the warring factions in the country, but also the other actors who are supplying arms to the ongoing conflict. So this would mean putting pressure to countries like the UAE, Russia, China. Of course, it's not going to be easy, but again, given the overall, the sheer size of the conflict itself and the potential implications of it, I think it is something that we need to try to tackle as an international community. We earlier mentioned about both the refugees within the country as well as flowing into the neighboring regions. And when we think about migration or refugees, typically people think about people moving to Western countries, like, for example, Europe or maybe the United States. But oftentimes the greatest proportion of the people who are fleeing the countries are going to the neighboring countries, which are, again, also facing not that much of a kind of a hospitable situation right now, as we've seen from, say, countries like Libya. So if we were to really try to think very carefully about the ripple effects that can come from not just the conflict itself, but the humanitarian concerns coming from the refugee crisis, potential refugee crisis that can affect the region and the neighboring countries as well, I think this is, again, something that the international community need to take really seriously.
In the movie The Shawshank Redemption, the protagonist Andy Dufresne says, "Remember, Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." In today's world that is so rife with terrible conflicts, we cannot afford to lose hope for a better world more than ever. Let's move on to the next topic. An increasing average life expectancy means that most people will live to old age and work longer. We are already seeing that many of the elderly are still active in economy. Here are the rankings of the countries with a higher labor force participation rate among those aged 65 or older. Please take a look. In OECD member countries, about 15% of their elderly population participate in labor on average. But on the rankings, top 10 countries all show a figure higher than the OECD average, 15%. In particular, Korea and Iceland, which are number 1 and number 2, record a senior employment rate that is more than double the OECD average. Other countries on the top 10 list, like Japan, New Zealand, Mexico, Colombia, and Israel, also have a rate higher than 20%. So, Professor Kim, it is safe to say that this is a global trend here to stay with us, not just limited to some countries?
Unfortunately, it seems like that will be. It seems like that will be the global trend. And so, right now, by 2030, older workers, so those that are 55 years and older, will fill up to 150 million more jobs globally. And so, this is mostly the case in higher income countries, such as the G7 countries, where by 2030, older workers will exceed 1/4 of the workforce. And so, this, in the case of Japan, for example, those 55 and older are going to make a 40% of the workforce and 30% in Germany. But this is not just happening in higher income countries. We're seeing this in other countries as well. So in the case of China, the older population, those 65 and older, are going to double by 2050. And Brazil's proportion of workers are also growing, which means that because there is this kind of growing larger population that's mostly from the older side, the retirement age is getting pushed back, and young people are not joining the employment force as much.
So let's focus on the case of South Korea. For the first time this year, the workers who are 65 or older outnumbers the younger workers in South Korea. What accounts for this phenomenon in Korea?
Right. On the one hand, it's easy to think about a little bit of the positive side. If we try really hard, say there's a change in perception in society, working till when you're in the older ages is something that can help you with sort of participating in society.
Age is only number.
Right, things like those. But of course, there are structural problems as well. So we've been hearing over and over again in the news that Korea now has one of the fastest aging population in the world. South Korea is experiencing one of the fastest rates of population aging globally. So by July 2024, the senior population exceeded 10 million, accounting for 19.6% of the total population. So the demographic shift itself is naturally contributing to the changes in the potential pool of workers. This is coupled by the extremely low fertility rate as well. So in February 2022, the elderly population overtook the younger demographics in terms of the overall population size as well. So the fact that now in terms of the labor population, the older population exceeded the young, I think is just a natural change that's coming from the population structural change. I also need to mention some of the policy measures that has been somewhat inadequate as well. So the national pension scheme in Korea offers very, relatively speaking, low payout, which is about 600,000 won, just amounting to about like $450 on average per month, which is insufficient to cover the cost of living. So many people are, after retirement, coming back to the labor force to try to supplement their income. And there is the gap between when you become eligible for receiving these national pensions, which is typically around the age of 60, and when the people retire, and the eligibility, which starts around like 63 to 65. So in order to cover this gap a few years where you're not going with any income, people are also coming back to the workforce. And finally, one important thing to mention is the poverty rates, the structure of the poverty rates in the Korean society. So nearly about 40% of South Koreans over the age of 65 are living below the OECD poverty line. So given the fact that many people in the old ages are facing, relatively speaking, insufficient income and even poverty, coming back to the labor force to supplement their income, I think is a very natural progression.
I see. So if this is a natural progression, then the government and companies have to make their responses to this phenomenon, because the phenomenon is here to stay with us. What are the responses by the governments and companies to the senior, workers in the market, especially the injury to work?
Right. So. So some studies suggest that they do enjoy working. obviously, advances in medical technology have also improved the health of the older generation, which is making it easier for them to work. And also, as you mentioned, a lot of seniors have reported, according to some surveys, that they find fulfillment in their jobs, and that they have less stress and greater life satisfaction when they are working. But as Professor Ree mentioned, part of it is because they need to make money, right? Because the pension is low, because they find it necessary to work and earn an income. There's a gap between when they retire and when they get the pension, and the pension itself is quite small. And so because of that, there's insufficient retirement funds. They need to work in order to make money and to have a basic standard of living. So because of that, the Korean government is working to introduce a continued employment system where people can continue to work after retirement. And now this is still in the early stages, so there's no clear structure in terms of how it's being organized, but some ways this may be implemented is through a re-employment plan after retirement, so re-employing retired people. Another is extending the legal retirement age, and then another is abolishing the retirement age altogether. And so small and medium enterprises right now are working to adopt something similar to this.
Sorry, are there any more negative side effects or the phenomena related to this senior employment?
Right, I think this is very complicated overall because as Professor Kim mentioned just now, the government, for example, has been under different administrations trying to help seniors to regain employment after their retirement in their old age. But at the same time, many of these schemes had led to people working in relatively lower quality jobs. So these are typically low-skilled jobs where your own skills that's been developed for decades of work are not necessarily matching the type of work that you're doing. The salaries are typically lower. They may also be in precarious working conditions as well. Although actively working yourself can have some potential mental and physical health benefits, there are also reports suggesting that people working in especially these lower skilled jobs in their older ages can lead to greater challenges for their physical and mental health. For the overall sort of economic structure as well, there can be also complications as well, because typically these lower skilled jobs filled by older population can lead to lower productivity. So the Bank of Korea, for example, provides analysis suggesting that the retirement of later generations, baby boomers, could actually reduce South Korea's growth potentials by about 0.4 percentage points because of the lack of economic productivity filled with these people in these positions. Furthermore, the presence of seniors willing to work for lower wages in certain sectors can suppress overall wage growth in certain sectors as well. So there can be a sort of a negative pressure for the wage growth. And of course, if you're working in some of these lower skilled jobs, then it could further get the people to experience further challenges. Health risks can be also something that we can consider. But more broadly speaking, I think what we are probably seeing is going to be widening inequality within the older population as well. So those who can actually somehow connect their skill sets to better jobs even after retirements for sustaining their employment can still be actively participating and happily do so.
I want to belong to that though.
Right. Hopefully we all want to, but greater proportion of the elderly population re-entering into the job market are typically going to face lower quality jobs with relatively worse working conditions and with a smaller salary. And this is again, we're talking about a population with about 40% facing poverty according to the OECD standards. So what we probably are going to face is going to be the widening gap in terms of economic inequality among the older population.
So Professor, what is going to happen to me in the next 10 years? If this is an irreversible trend, then the government has to devise a solution for it, right? Are there some countries that have been quite successful in dealing with this problem or the phenomenon that South Korea can emulate?
So I don't know what would happen to you specifically in 10 years, but one thing that the Korean government can do is to adopt, things that other countries are doing. So for example, in the case of Japan right now is pushing the official retirement age from 60 to 61 years old. And so if Korea can do something similar to that, I think that could also be very beneficial. And also because the system works where firms can release workers and then rehire them in the case of Japan, that could also help. But as Professor Ree mentioned, this could lead to economic inequality among the senior citizens as well. And so providing a better environment for seniors to work in would help helping them reskill with their reskills, as well as providing this kind of more better healthy environment, I think would be most beneficial.
Another problem I foresee is an exacerbation of the competition between different generations of the employees. That rehiring seniors may make situation even worse for the potential employees in the younger generations, right? Demographic change compels many advanced and growing economies to face a tough reality. In order to allow their population to live long and prosper, the governments must find innovative solutions. This is the last episode of the Roundtable, which began on October 10th last year. Over the past year, we have discussed and analyzed a wide range of global issues every week. So professors, would you like to share your experiences and memories of the Roundtable with us?
Well, I think this was a very unique platform that brings a global perspective to very different issues around the world. And considering that we're living in an increasingly integrated world, having different events around the world affecting each other very closely, I think this was a very important and useful, hopefully, to our viewers, platform for everyone. It saddens me that this is coming to an end, but with this opportunity, I would like to thank Dr. Bong and the excellent staff, as well as the viewers, for allowing us to have this platform and share this experience with others.
And your participation and contribution is definitely much appreciated.
Thank you.
How about you, Professor Kim?
I completely agree with Professor Ree. The past year we've talked about so many different topics, and we've just had this space and opportunity to have these discussions, not just in terms of politics, but also social as well. And with a lot more interesting things coming up in politics within the next year, I hope that people continue to watch similar shows and at Arirang. So,
Right, definitely.
Yeah.
Sending you best wishes, we have to say goodbye. We appreciate your support and interest.